Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine two rivers. One winds through a long green valley carved out of red desert rock. Its waters dark and heavy, with ancient silt, flooding every year with almost clockwork precision. This is the Nile. Along its banks, people who called themselves the Children of Ra built monuments that still defy explanation. They carved gods into stone with the confidence of people who had been speaking to the divine for thousands of years and developed a worldview so cohesive it lasted for more than 3,000 years with barely a crack. Now imagine two more rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, threading through a flat, sun-scorched land between mountain ranges and the Persian Gulf, flooding unpredictably, violently, reshaping the world around them with the kind of randomness that makes people feel small and at the mercy of forces they cannot understand. This is Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. Here, people who called themselves the servants of the great gods built towering stepped temples called ziggurats. They inscribed their stories onto clay in a language that would not be deciphered for thousands of years and developed a theology so detailed, so emotionally raw, that it reads like something a person actually experienced. These two civilizations, ancient Egypt and ancient Sumer, are among the oldest complex societies in human history. They were roughly contemporary. They built extraordinary things. And when you lay their mythologies side by side, something strange happens. You find the same gods wearing different faces. You find the craftsman creator, the god of wisdom and deep water, the god of sky and supreme authority, the hidden father god, the goddess of love and war, the serpent god of secret knowledge. You find the flood that almost ended everything. You find the feather that weighs a human soul. You find the winged disk blazing across the sky. Some scholars say this is because human beings everywhere naturally create the same kinds of stories to explain the same kinds of experiences. Others point to the documented trade routes and cultural contact between the Nile Valley and Mesopotamia that began as early as 3500 BCE and continued for thousands of years. A third camp, the ancient astronaut theorists, suggest something far more dramatic, that the gods of Egypt and Sumer are memories of the same actual beings known to the Sumerians as the Anunnaki. Tonight, we are going to walk through all three of those frameworks. We are going to look at the documented history, the real archaeology, the actual trade routes, the clay tablets, and stone carvings. By the end of this, you will have something rare, a complete picture, what we actually know, what we can reasonably speculate about, and where the genuine mystery still lives. Two of the most ancient civilizations on Earth, separated by desert and sea, built theology around gods who look, act, and speak in ways that feel like they came from the same source. That is worth sitting with in the dark, long after everyone else has gone to sleep. Before we can talk about what Egypt and Sumer shared, we need to understand who they actually were. Not as abstractions, but as living, breathing cultures. Sumer came first, or at least the written record of Sumer did. The civilization that arose in the southern part of what is now Iraq is generally considered the first true urban society. By around 4000 BCE, cities like Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, and were already functioning as genuine metropolises with specialized labor, centralized administration, monumental architecture, and the first recognizable writing system. Cuneiform script developed in Sumer around 3200 BCE, and while its earliest surviving examples are largely economic records, it quickly became the medium through which an entire cosmology was recorded. The Sumerian world was built on a particular emotional foundation: anxiety. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded unpredictably, storms came without warning, disease could sweep through a city for no discernible reason. The gods were real and present in Sumerian theology, but they were not reliable allies. They had their own agendas. They punished humanity, sometimes simply because they could. The Sumerian divine pantheon was organized in a very specific hierarchy. Anu, Enlil, Enki at the top, then dozens more deities in a structure that resembled a divine bureaucracy. Human beings in Sumerian thought existed to serve the gods. They were created from clay, mixed with divine blood, so the lesser gods could rest from their labor. Egypt was different in almost every emotional register. The Nile Valley was a world of relative abundance. The flood came every year, like a promise kept. The desert that surrounded this green strip of fertility was dangerous, but also protective. Egypt was naturally defended on almost all sides. The Egyptians worshipped a concept they called ma'at, truth, justice, balance, and right order, as fundamental to the structure of the universe. The Egyptian pantheon was vast, but certain fixed points persisted. Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Thoth, Set, Anubis, real beings with real preferences and real power over the world of the living. The temples were not museums. They were actual houses of the gods, maintained by priests who dressed the cult statues, fed them, bathed them, and carried them in procession. So we have two civilizations, one in Mesopotamia, built on anxiety and divine contract, one in the Nile Valley, built on cosmic confidence and a theology of eternal persistence. They look very different on the surface, and then you start reading their creation myths, their god stories, their royal ideology, their sacred symbols, and something begins to feel very familiar. The easy answer to why do Egypt and Sumer share so many patterns is also the correct first answer. They were in contact. The relationship between Egypt and Mesopotamia goes back at least to around 3500 BCE, when both cultures were in the early stages of state formation. In Egyptian tombs from this period, archaeologists have found Mesopotamian-style pottery, red-slipped spouted jars, of the kind commonly manufactured in Nippur, and Uruk, cylinder seals. The distinctively Mesopotamian carved stone rollers appear in Egyptian contexts from around 3300 BCE. The Gebel el-Arak knife handle, dated to around 3300 to 3200 BCE, shows a bearded figure in a Sumerian-style tunic standing between two lions in the Master of Animals pose. The boats on that same handle are not Egyptian-style boats. They are high-prowed vessels, distinctly Mesopotamian in design. The Narmer palette also shows imagery traced directly to Mesopotamian sources, including the intertwined long-necked serpents framing a circular space. Mesopotamian recessed niche temple facades appear in early Egyptian royal tombs. The stepped pyramid of Djoser echoes the principle of the ziggurat. A 2025 genetic study provided direct evidence of ancestry related to the Eastern Fertile Crescent in ancient Egypt, suggesting migration flows accompanied cultural exchange. The shared symbols we will examine, the winged disc, the feather of truth, the serpent imagery, the divine craftsman, the hidden father god, were not traded like pottery or jewelry. They were deeper than that. Two civilizations, separated by hundreds of miles of desert and sea, were sharing manufacturing techniques for luxury materials like blue glass and artistic iconography for divine power. If you had to choose one pair of deities from opposite ends of the ancient Near East and hold them up as mirrors of each other, Enki and Ptah might be the most compelling choice available. Enki was the Sumerian god of fresh water, wisdom, magic, fertility, craftsmanship, and creation. His Akkadian name was Ea, Lord of the House of Water. He was worshipped primarily at Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer. Eridu sat at the edge of the Abzu, the vast underground reservoir of sweet fresh water that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the world. Enki was the lord of this Abzu, this cosmic underwater palace, and from there he dispensed wisdom, power, and the divine decrees that made civilization possible. The included things like kingship, priesthood, descent into the underworld, music, the craft of the smith, writing, warfare, literally everything that made human life more than mere survival. This is a god of enormous conceptual sophistication, and he was not merely theoretical. The Enki of the myths was a vivid personality, marked by cunning and compassion. He warned the flood hero Atrahasis of the coming deluge, speaking through the wall of a reed hut to preserve plausible deniability. With Enlil, he tricked the demon Asag by creating a champion from clay. He restored the world when it had been stripped of its life. Ptah was the great god of Memphis, the most important city of Lower Egypt, and during much of the Old Kingdom, the political capital of the entire country. The very name Egypt is likely derived from the Greek rendering of Ptah, the temple of the soul of Ptah. Ptah was the god of craftsmen, architects, sculptors, painters, builders, and all who made things. He was the patron of Imhotep, the genius architect of the step pyramid at Saqqara, who was himself eventually deified. Ptah did not create through violence or physical generation. Ptah created through thought and speech, conceiving things in his heart and bringing them into existence by speaking their names. According to the Memphite theology, Ptah imagined all things first in his heart, then spoke them into being. He was the divine mind behind reality, the intelligence that preceded and organized everything that exists. Now hold that idea against Enki and the me. Both Enki and Ptah are the cosmic source of the organized structures that make the world intelligible and civilization possible. Both are craftsmen in the most profound sense, not just makers of physical things, but architects of the divine order. Both are associated with deep water. Enki with the Abzu, Ptah with the nun beneath Memphis. Ptah is always depicted as a tightly wrapped, mummiform figure, holding a composite scepter, his skin often blue-green, the color of fertility, water, and life. The same blue-green appears on Nun, the primordial deep, and in Mesopotamian iconography of the Abzu, the realm of Enki. Both deities are also associated with the underworld and with resurrection. Ptah was sometimes merged with Sokar and Osiris to become Ptah-Sokar Osiris, a resurrection deity. Enki's profile maps onto Ptah, Khnum, and Banebdidete, a cluster of craftsmen and creator gods. Khnum was worshipped near the first cataract, at the source of the Nile's annual flood, water understood as the source of all life. If we are careful, the most defensible statement is this: Enki and Ptah represent the same archetype in their respective civilizations. Both are the master craftsmen of creation, source of knowledge and technology, distinguished by intelligence and craft, rather than brute power. Whether that archetype reflects shared cultural inheritance, universal human imagination, or a single being remembered differently, the parallel is real and specific. There is a particular kind of God that every major ancient civilization seemed to need, the supreme authority, not the hidden father sitting above everything, but the active ruler whose will is the will of the world. In Sumer, this role belonged most fully to Enlil. In Egypt, across most of its history, it belonged to Ra. Enlil's name means Lord Wind, or Lord of the Air, the upper atmosphere, where weather is made. He sat at Nippur, the religious capital of Sumer, in his great temple the Ekor, the mountain house, and from there he ruled. His word was absolute. Even Anu, technically his superior, rarely overrode Enlil's judgments in the myths. Enlil in the stories is a god of tremendous power and occasional terrible mercy. He was the one who decided to send the flood. He was the one who destroyed the cities of Sumer in the lamentation texts. The lament for the destruction of describes a city already dead, and its patron goddess weeping in exile, and at the center is always the decree of Enlil. The storm, the flood raging over the land, these were Enlil's tools. His pleasure was order, his anger was annihilation. And yet Enlil was not simply a god of destruction, he was also the source of legitimate kingship. Royal inscriptions claim the king was chosen by Enlil, given the shepherd's staff, set upon the throne by Enlil. He was the executive authority in the divine government, the one who made things happen in the world below. Ra in Egypt occupied a position with remarkable structural parallels. Ra was the sun god, and the sun was the very engine of existence. Every morning Ra rose from the eastern horizon in his solar bark, sailed across the sky, and entered the western horizon at sunset. At night, he journeyed through the Duat, battling the serpent Apep, until he was reborn again at dawn. If Ra ever failed to make the journey, if Apep truly defeated him, creation would end. Ra was the supreme solar ruler, father of the gods in some traditions, king of the divine council in the New Kingdom. When Egypt's power was greatest, the pharaoh was called the son of Ra, literally Ra's earthly child and representative. Maintaining Ra's victory over chaos was the core of royal religious obligation. Ra's image, the solar disk, appears above the heads of kings, on temple walls, on royal documents. Now sit those two figures side by side and feel the resonance. Enlil, lord of the upper atmosphere, source of weather and storm, giver of kingship, controller of fate. Ra, lord of the sun, daily victor over chaos and darkness, source of royal legitimacy, controller of time through the solar cycle. Both are supreme active gods. Both legitimize earthly kings. Both are associated with sky and light and have the authority to unmake the world. In the new kingdom, Ra was merged with Amun to become Amun-Ra, almost a single supreme deity. At the same time in Mesopotamia, Marduk was elevated in Babylon, absorbing the roles of Enlil and Enki. These political theological mergers created supreme deities whose worship was inseparable from imperial power. The parallel between Enlil and Ra is ultimately the parallel between two civilizations' answer to the same question: what does ultimate divine authority look like? There is a particular theological category that appears across many ancient religions: the hidden God. Not the active ruler, not the hands-on craftsman, but the original source who was there before everything else. In Sumer, this role belonged to Anu. Anu's name literally meant sky in Sumerian, and like the sky, he was everywhere and yet hard to grasp. He was the father of the gods, creator of the divine order, original king of heaven. In the great Sumerian triad, he occupied the highest position, with Enlil and Enki as his sons and subordinates. His cult center was Uruk, and his temple there, the Inanna, the house of heaven, was one of the most magnificent structures of the ancient world. Despite being nominally the highest god, he was oddly passive in the myths. The active decisions, the flood, the destruction of cities, the granting of kingship, were almost always made by Enlil or Enki. Anu's character became increasingly theoretical, his name standing for heaven itself rather than a personal deity. He receded from active divine politics into a kind of cosmic background. The highest god of Sumer was, in a sense, the most invisible, present everywhere. As the sky is present everywhere, Egypt had its own hidden god. And the parallel is striking. Amun, the hidden one, was one of the most ancient deities of Egypt. Originally a minor local deity of Thebes, Amun was worshipped as a god of wind and hidden creative power. Like Anu, Amun was defined partly by his invisibility and transcendence, while Ra was visible, blazing across the sky. Amun was the invisible wind, the unseen breath of creation. His image in art wore a double-plumed crown, skin sometimes blue, to suggest his celestial and invisible nature. Traditions surrounding him emphasized that no human image could truly capture him. People have noticed the phonetic proximity of Anu and Amun. Scholars reject an etymological link, but the similarity invites speculation. What is beyond speculation is the structural parallel in the mythology. Both Anu and Amun are described as self-created, neither having a father or mother in the conventional genealogy. Both are described as the original source from which the universe came, father of the gods, in the sense of originating principle. Both recede over time from active divine politics into increasingly abstract universal roles. In the beginning there was Nun. From the primordial waters, Amun birthed himself, the hidden god, the force of creation. The Sumerian counterpart speaks of Tiamat's boiling sea and Anu, father of the heavens, emerging among the first of the gods. Both gods emerge from primordial watery chaos as the prior source of divine existence. Amun's great temple complex at Karnak became the most powerful religious institution in Egypt. The Amun priesthood accumulated wealth and land that at times rivaled the pharaoh's power. Akhenaten's heresy targeted the Amun cult, closing his temples and raising the Aten as sole god. Anu's temple at Uruk, the White Temple, was similarly ancient and central. Uruk at its height was the largest city on earth. The parallel between Anu and Amun tells us both cultures recognized a divine source that transcended even the visible sky gods. In both, the hidden god was eventually merged with more active deities or overshadowed by gods who were easier to pray to and blame. The hidden god represents a move from polytheism towards something that rhymes with monotheism, a single omnipresent source behind diverse divine personalities. That both Sumer and Egypt made this move in such similar ways is one of the most underappreciated parallels in ancient religion. If there is a single figure in ancient religion who seems to have refused to stay in one place, it is the great goddess of love and war. In Sumer she was Inanna. Later, absorbed into the Akkadian culture, she became Ishtar. Her energy, her stories, and her attributes appear in Hathor, in Isis, in Astarte, in Aphrodite. Everywhere beauty and danger are folded into one goddess. Inanna is one of the most vivid personalities in all of ancient literature. She was the goddess of sexual love in its most raw and unapologetic form. She was the goddess of warfare, depicted in armor, mounted for battle. She could make a man into a woman and a woman into a man. She was the owner of the me, the divine decrees of civilization. She famously won the me from Enki in a legendary drinking contest. She loaded them onto her celestial barge and sailed away with the infrastructure of civilization, while Enki slept off his beer. Her most famous myth is her descent into the underworld. She stripped off her divine attributes, one by one, as she passed through each of the 7 gates. She arrived in the land of the dead, naked and powerless, before the throne of her sister Ereshkigal. She was killed and hung on a hook, and eventually restored to life. Her return required a substitute, her consort Dumuzi, who spent half the year in the underworld, while his sister spent the other half. This myth of descent, death, and return is one foundation of the dying and rising complex, seen across cultures. Hathor in Egypt was on the surface very different, serene, beautiful, associated with music, dance, love, and the sky. She was depicted as a woman with the head of a cow, or with cow's horns framing a solar disk. Her cult goes back to the earliest historical period. The Greeks identified Hathor with Aphrodite. Hathor was patroness of women, of joy, of intoxication, of the sexual exuberance that sustains life. But Hathor had another face. In the destruction of mankind myth, Ra sends the Eye of Ra in the form of Sekhmet to punish humanity. Sekhmet is lion-headed, ravenous for blood, impossible to stop once she begins. Ra tricks her into drinking beer dyed red. So she believes it is blood. Drunk, she collapses, and the massacre ends. Many Egyptologists argue Hathor and Sekhmet are aspects of the same divine power. Gentle and terrible, love and destruction, beauty and annihilation, music and warfare. These are the polarities both Inanna and Ishtar, and Hathor and Sekhmet embody. Isis is a different but related figure, great mother, devoted wife, ultimate magician. She gathered the scattered pieces of Osiris, restored him enough to conceive Horus, and held the divine family together through a succession crisis. She was cunning where Inanna was bold, strategic where Hathor was immediate. The Egyptian tradition seems to have distributed the qualities of the Mesopotamian great goddess across Hathor and Sekhmet and Isis. Together, they add up to something very close to the full profile of Inanna. If Enki and Ptah are the master craftsmen of creation, then Ningishzida and Thoth are the master record keepers of creation. Ningishzida's name means Lord of the Good Tree. He is associated with the underworld, with sacred serpents, with the mysterious processes by which life emerges from death. In some traditions, he is a gatekeeper of the underworld, standing at the threshold between the realms of the living and the dead. His iconography is pure serpent. On the libation vase of Gudea, 2 serpents or dragon creatures emerge from his shoulders. That image, a central staff with 2 entwined serpent forms, is so close to the later Caduceus that you almost can't help noticing it. Thoth, Jehuti, was the Egyptian god of writing, wisdom, the moon, and the precise structuring of knowledge. He was called the heart of Ra and the tongue of Ra, the one who speaks the will of the Creator into clear form. If Ra is the blazing intention of the universe, Thoth is the operating manual. In the judgment of the dead, Thoth stands beside the scales, recording the weight of the heart against the feather of Ma'at. He is not there as a moralist, he is there as an accountant, a cosmic clerk. Ningishzida appears in the Adapa myth in a similar role, a gatekeeper following procedures, knowing exactly what is permitted and what is not. He is connected with the mysterious Apkallu, the sage beings who brought civilization to humanity in Mesopotamian lore. In some lists, Ningishzida himself is counted among these Apkallu, a divine sage. Thoth plays the same role for Egypt, patron of scribes, inventor of writing, keeper of the divine library. A medieval Hermetic text calls him the author of thousands of books on nature, the gods, and the hidden structure of the world. Both Ningishzida and Thoth are deeply tied to the serpent, not as simple evil, but as a symbol of secret, functional knowledge. The serpent can kill or heal. It can whisper the trick that unravels a whole system, or the formula that holds it together. Modern medicine still uses a serpent staff as its symbol, a distant echo of this ancient association. Both sit at thresholds of worlds, of knowledge, of life and death, and both decide who gets to pass. Both are associated with what you might call the technology of cosmic order. In Mesopotamian thought, the great risk was always chaos, dissolution of the ordered world back into primordial waters. The role of the wisdom deity was to prevent this by knowing the formulas, the sequences, and the precise rituals that maintained the boundary between cosmos and chaos. In Egypt, that same function belonged to Maat and to Thoth as her administrator. The weighing of the heart was a technical procedure for determining whether a soul was ordered enough to continue in the structured world of the blessed dead. In both traditions, what makes the wisdom god powerful is not goodness, but accuracy. In a universe that can dissolve into chaos, if the accounting is done wrong, you want the accountant to be infallible. This is why the serpent is so appropriate as their symbol, not moral knowledge, but functional knowledge of how things work beneath the surface. Whether that knowledge is used for healing or harm is a separate question. The serpent simply knows that pure structural knowledge, amoral but essential, is what both Ningishzida and Thoth embody. If there is a single story that the ancient world could not stop telling, a story that appears in Sumer, in Babylon, in India, in China, in Mesoamerica, it is the story of a great flood that nearly destroyed humanity. The flood myth is arguably the most widely distributed narrative in human religious history, and at its oldest surviving textual sources, it sits squarely in the world of the Anunnaki. The Atrahasis epic is the first known written flood narrative, dating to around 1700 BCE, preserving much older Sumerian oral traditions. In this story, the great gods created humanity to serve them, doing the labor the Igigi had grown too weary to perform. But humanity multiplied, and their noise, not wickedness, not sin, but noise, disturbed Enlil's sleep. Enlil, frustrated, sent plague, then drought, then famine, to reduce their numbers. Each time, Enki, who loved humanity, quietly warned his devotee Atrahasis and showed him how to save his people. Finally, Enlil convinced the council to send a flood so complete that no human would survive. Enki was bound by oath not to warn humanity, so he did what Enki always did. He found the loophole. He spoke to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, telling the wall to inform its owner to dismantle his house and build a boat. Atrahasis built a sealed boat, loaded it with animals, grain, and his family, and waited. 7 days and 7 nights of flood followed. All other humanity perished. When the waters receded, Atrahasis offered sacrifices. The gods, hungry from the lack of offerings, gathered around the smoke like flies. Enlil was furious to find survivors. Enki defended his actions, and a compromise was reached. No more total floods, but death, disease, and limits on fertility instead. The Epic of Gilgamesh later retold the flood story through Utnapishtim, with details even closer to the biblical Noah. Boat dimensions, bitumen-sealed hull, sending out birds to test for dry land. The overlap in specifics is hard to ignore. In 1872, when George Smith translated the Gilgamesh flood tablet and realized what he was reading, he reportedly jumped up in the middle of a lecture and began taking his clothes off. But what about Egypt? Egypt is absent from the usual list of flood myth civilizations. The Nile flooded predictably, beneficently. Egyptian mythology has no world-ending deluge. But Egypt has something else, the destruction of mankind, Ra sending out Sekhmet to punish humanity. In both Atrahasis and the destruction of mankind, Ra sending out Sekhmet to punish humanity. In both Atrahasis and the destruction of mankind, a supreme god decides humanity has become intolerable and must be destroyed. A terrifying agent of annihilation is unleashed, water in one, a blood-drunk lioness in the other. Other gods intervene to stop the destruction before humanity is entirely gone. Humanity is preserved, but at a cost. Some divine gift or protection is withdrawn or changed. In Mesopotamia, the mechanism is flood. In Egypt, it is the burning fury of Sekhmet, the eye of Ra. Both disasters grow out of the landscape. Mesopotamians feared their rivers, Egyptians feared heat, drought, and the withdrawal of the Nile. In Atrahasis, the trigger is noise, the uproar of too many humans being too human. In the Egyptian story, the trigger is insolence, humanity plotting against the aging Ra, mocking his diminished power. In both cases, the gods are responding to a disruption of the divine order, a failure in the human-divine relationship. In both myths, catastrophe is averted not by the punishing god, but by intelligence, magic, or cunning, Enki's loophole, and Sekhmet's drunkenness. Some scholars think Mesopotamian flood stories may preserve memories of real catastrophic floods in the Persian Gulf or the Black Sea. Whether or not that is true, the story traveled through the Levant, through people moving between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean world. We cannot say for certain whether a literal flood story reached Egypt and became the Sekhmet myth, or whether both arose independently to answer the same question. What can be said is that both traditions share the same structure and reach the same unsettling conclusion about gods and humans. When you start looking at the symbols Egypt and Mesopotamia used for the divine, the parallels become even harder to ignore. Start with the winged disk, the image of a circle or sun with outstretched wings hovering above the world. In Egypt, the winged sun appears over temple entrances as a seal of divine protection. In Mesopotamia, a similar winged disk floats above kings in battle and ceremony, signaling royal legitimacy and heavenly endorsement. Scholars can track this motif traveling, born in Egypt, adopted and transformed in Syria, then carried into Assyrian and Babylonian art. Then there is the feather, specifically the feather of Ma'at. In the Egyptian judgment of the dead, a human heart is weighed against this feather, too heavy, and the soul is devoured. The feather stands for an abstract principle, truth, balance, right order, the way the universe is supposed to work. In Mesopotamia, there is no single feather, but there is the me, the divine decrees, that make civilization and cosmic order possible. The me are not laws in the legal sense. They are the underlying patterns: kingship, priesthood, music, wisdom, warfare, craft, descent into the underworld. Both cultures had a concept of cosmic law that even the gods in some sense had to respect. The feather of Maat is Egypt's visible symbol of this principle. The me are Sumers. They are different images for the same intuition. The universe is ordered. That order has moral content, and the job of gods and humans is to maintain it. There is one more symbol worth dwelling on before we move forward: the Ankh, Egypt's famous symbol of life. The Ankh has been compared to the Sumerian symbol for the Abzu, Enki's underwater palace of sweet fresh water, the source of all life in Sumerian cosmology. The visual match is not exact, but the conceptual resonance is powerful. In both traditions, there is a single glyph that encapsulates the mystery of why there is life at all, why there is something rather than nothing. The Egyptians held it as an object a god could hand you, the literal key to life. The Sumerians placed it in the world as a place, the Abzu, the underground reservoir whose water made cities and agriculture possible. Both are symbols of a hidden source of vitality that exists beneath the visible world and must be accessed and maintained. The Egyptians expressed it as an object you could carry. The Sumerians expressed it as a place you could inhabit. The crossed swords of Set and the storms of Enlil, the ibis of Thoth and the stylus of Ningishzida, the solar bark of Ra crossing the underworld every night, and the boat of Atrahasis riding out the flood, the feather balanced against the heart, and the me weighed by the divine assembly, the hidden God who is everywhere, and the hidden God who is the wind, the craftsman who speaks the world into being, and the craftsman who holds the decrees that structure reality. These are not random resemblances, they are a pattern, and patterns in the ancient world were never accidental. Patterns were divine. In ancient Egypt, there was no single creation story. Different cities and cult centers each had their own account of how the world began, and these accounts coexisted without obvious contradiction. Of all these, the Memphite theology, centered on Ptah, is arguably the most philosophically sophisticated. The Memphite theology is preserved on the Shabaka stone, a large black granite slab now in the British Museum. The inscription claims it was copied from a worm-eaten older document, likely going back to the Old Kingdom. In this theology, creation begins in Ptah's mind. He conceives every being in his heart, the seat of intellect and will, then names each with his tongue. Every god, every creature, every aspect of the world originates as a thought in Ptah's heart and becomes real through his word. This is a genuine philosophical revolution, creation as mental and linguistic, not just physical generation or cosmic violence. One text calls Ptah the father of Atum, who later becomes the sun god Re. Re originates thoughts. Thoth gives words to those thoughts. Ptah gives them form. Ptah is the principle by which thought becomes matter, mind becomes world. Scholars have compared this to the Greek Logos, and especially the prologue to the Gospel of John. In the Memphite theology, divine mind, divine speech, and material reality are three phases of the same process. Mesopotamia has its own version of this idea. In Enki's me, the divine decrees he holds, in his Abzu palace, the me are sometimes described as objects, but understood as fundamental laws and technologies that structure reality. Both Ptah's creative speech and Enki's me represent divine blueprints, templates in the mind of the god, before they exist in matter. Enki's hymns describe how he organized the world, assigning each region its patron, each city its functions, each craft its knowledge. This organization by decree is structurally identical to Ptah's creation by naming. The Shabaka stone even says that the gods came into being in Ptah, and that every divine utterance manifested through what the heart devised and the tongue commanded. This approaches henotheism, all gods as expressions of a single underlying divine reality. The Memphite theology may preserve ideas 4,000 years old, describing a creator who works through intelligence and language and is source of all other gods. Across the desert in Sumer, Enki the craftsman holds the me and teaches humanity all the arts of civilization. The Memphite theology and the Eridu theology are not the same text, and Ptah is not simply Enki with an Egyptian name, but they work in the same conceptual territory, answering the same questions about how divine intelligence becomes the specific world we inhabit. That two civilizations at the dawn of history arrived at such similar answers remains one of the most profound puzzles of ancient religion. If there is one institution where the parallels between Egypt and Mesopotamia become almost eerie, it is kingship. In both worlds, the king was not just a political leader, he was the hinge between humans and the gods. Sumerian royal inscriptions constantly repeat that the king was chosen by Enlil and set on the throne by the great gods. Egyptian texts say the pharaoh is the son of Ra, beloved of Amun, the living Horus on earth. In both traditions, kingship descends from the sky. It is a gift, not a human invention. The Sumerian king list presents kingship itself as an entity that descended from heaven to the first cities. Egyptian coronation scenes show the gods literally crowning the pharaoh, tying his rule to the maintenance of Ma'at. In Mesopotamia, the king's job was to keep the gods fed, housed, and honored, so they would continue to protect the city. In Egypt, the pharaoh's job was to uphold Ma'at, so the Nile would flood, the sun would rise, and the stars would keep their paths. Failure of a king was never just personal incompetence. It threatened the fabric of reality. Rebellions and invasions were read as signs the gods had withdrawn their favor from the king. In both civilizations, royal inscriptions scramble to show that any disaster was caused by a previous bad ruler, not the current one. The language is almost interchangeable. He restored the temples, he renewed the offerings, he established justice, he made the gods content again. Egypt added another layer. The king himself was divine, the living embodiment of Horus, and in death united with Osiris. Mesopotamia usually stopped short of that. Kings were chosen by the gods, occasionally semi-divine, but not the gods themselves. Yet on the ground, the function was the same, a single human figure whose personal fate carried the fate of the whole country. When the king prospered, the land prospered. When he failed, the land withered. This is why royal ideology in both Egypt and Mesopotamia is saturated with cosmic language. A king was not merely ruling people, he was helping hold the universe together. We have spent the last 11 chapters exploring the very real, very documented, and in many cases quite extraordinary parallels between the religious and symbolic systems of ancient Sumer and ancient Egypt. We have tracked those parallels through trade routes and archaeology, through mythology and iconography, through the structure of divine kingship and the architecture of sacred space. Now it is time to sit honestly with the theory that has made these parallels famous to millions of people who have never read a cuneiform tablet or walked through the museum in Cairo: the ancient astronaut theory. Let's be clear from the start about what this section is and is not. This section is not here to debunk the ancient astronaut theory with scorn, nor to endorse it as proven fact. What this section is here to do is present the theory in its strongest, most coherent form, not the pop history caricature, but the actual argument, and then examine what it explains, what it fails to explain, and where it moves from reasonable speculation into genuinely problematic territory. The foundational text of the modern ancient astronaut interpretation of the Anunnaki is Zecharia Sitchin's 1976 book, The 12th Planet. Sitchin argued, based on his personal translations of Sumerian cuneiform texts, that the Anunnaki were not mythological beings, but actual extraterrestrial entities from a planet he called Nibiru, a 12th body in the solar system with a very long elliptical orbit that brought it close to Earth every 3,600 years. In Sitchin's reading, the Anunnaki came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold, which they needed for their planet's atmosphere. The labor of mining was performed first by lesser Anunnaki, the Igigi. But when the Igigi revolted, Enki and Ningishzida engineered a new worker, Homo sapiens, created through genetic manipulation of existing hominids using Anunnaki DNA. In Sitchin's interpretation, the Sumerian texts describing Enki and Ningishzida creating humanity from clay and divine blood were literal biological descriptions rendered in metaphor. Within this framework, the Egyptian gods are not a separate tradition or a derivative tradition. They are the same beings, operating in Egypt directly. Enki and Ptah are the same individual known by two names. Ra and Enlil represent the same faction of Anunnaki leadership. The entire Egyptian pantheon, in the most extreme version of this theory, is the Anunnaki pantheon translated into the cultural language of the Nile Valley. The Egypt Female Tour Guide source notes that proponents say Egyptian achievements could not have been achieved without extraterrestrial assistance, and that depictions of gods interacting with humans suggest an advanced understanding of technology aligned with modern interpretations of alien contact. The most compelling arguments within the ancient astronaut framework, when presented honestly, come in several categories. First, there is the argument from the texts themselves. The Sumerian descriptions of the Anunnaki read like descriptions of real beings with specific details and petty family dramas. If these were pure allegory, the allegorical purpose is often opaque. Second, there is the argument from technology. Both Egypt and Sumer seem to appear with advanced cultural features in a relatively sudden burst, rather than after long observable development. The earliest hieroglyphics are already complex and systematic. The earliest cuneiform already has hundreds of signs. The step pyramid of Djoser appears as a stunning leap in architectural complexity and ambition. To the ancient astronaut theorist, these discontinuities suggest a transfer of knowledge rather than organic developments. Third, there is the argument from the specific parallels themselves. When you encounter something as specific as the Ningishzida and Thoth identification, trade routes begin to feel like a strained explanation. These are genuine questions, and the ancient astronaut theory has the virtue of taking them seriously rather than waving them away. However, the theory also has serious problems that must be acknowledged. Sitchin's translations of Sumerian texts have been consistently rejected by academic Assyriologists as systematically wrong. The Sumerian word he translates as rocket does not mean rocket. The word he translates as spaceport does not mean spaceport. His etymology for Anunnaki, as those who from heaven to earth came, has been challenged by scholars. The academic criticism more broadly is that ancient astronaut theories underestimate the capacities of ancient human beings, but you do not need to accept Sitchin's specific claims to take seriously the underlying observation that Egypt and Sumer share a deeper grammar than trade alone easily explains. The most sophisticated version of the argument is not really about aliens. It is about the possibility of a lost civilization. A pre-dynastic source culture, perhaps now underwater, from which both Sumer and Egypt derived foundational concepts. Graham Hancock and similar researchers point to the rapid emergence of complex culture after the Younger Dryas as evidence. This version is speculative, but not inherently unreasonable. We do know sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, flooding vast areas of coastal settlement. We do know sites like Göbekli Tepe predate Sumer and Egypt, and show sophisticated spiritual architecture among supposed hunter-gatherers. We do not know everything about what existed before the written record begins. Whether the shared grammar of Egypt and Sumer reflects extraterrestrial contact, a lost civilization, cultural diffusion, or deep universal patterns is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the parallels are real, they are specific, and they deserve more serious attention than they typically receive. Let us linger here a moment longer in the specifics, because there is something worth naming carefully before we close. Throughout this journey, we have examined gods and goddesses, symbols and myths, trade routes and genetic data, philosophical systems, and political theologies. We have found parallels that are structural, iconographic, narrative, and conceptual. We have been careful to label speculation as speculation and documented history as documented history. And at the end of all of that, a simple fact remains. These two civilizations built their relationship with the divine, using the same grammar, not the same vocabulary. The words are different, the names are different. The specific stories have their own shapes and textures, but the grammar, the underlying structure of how divine power is organized, how it relates to human life, is shared, too specific to be entirely accidental, and too widespread to be fully explained, by 600 years of documented trade contact. The Sumerians believed that before the flood, there was a time when the gods walked among humans directly. They called this the time before the kingship descended from heaven, when the Apkelu, the 7 divine sages, lived on earth and taught humanity. Fishmen, later traditions called them, beings who came from the deep water of the Abzu, stood beside the first kings and then disappeared back into the water when the flood came. The Egyptians believed in their own version of this, the Zep Tepi, the first time when the Neteru ruled Egypt directly, before they withdrew to the heavens and left only the pharaoh as their earthly representative. The records of this era were kept in the chambers of Jehuti, the archives of Thoth, said to be buried beneath the sands or waters of Egypt. Both civilizations preserved the memory of a time before memory, a time when something more than human was present on the earth, teaching and building. Whether you read this as metaphor, as a lost civilization, or as something literally divine, depends on what you are willing to entertain. But the fact that both traditions independently preserve this same memory is one of the most haunting parallels in this investigation. We live in the echo of that golden age. The temples of Karnak and the ziggurats of Ur are monuments of people trying to maintain contact with something they believed had once been present. They built to last. They carved in stone and pressed into clay because they were afraid of forgetting, afraid that the knowledge, the names, the divine grammar would be lost if they did not encode it into the hardest materials they had. Because of that fear, we can still sit here thousands of years later and read what they wrote. We can still trace the path of the winged disc from Memphis to Nippur. We can still hear Enki's voice through the reed wall and Ptah's voice speaking the world into existence. We can still see Thoth lifting his scribal palette and Ningishzida standing at the gate with serpents on his shoulders. We can still feel the weight of the heart against the feather, still watch the solar bark sail through the 12 hours of the night. These are not dead things. They are alive in the way that deep truths are always alive, waiting for the right moment, the right attention, the right quality of listening to reveal themselves again. Thank you for watching. If this kind of deep investigation is what you come here for, please like this video. It genuinely helps more people find the channel. And if you want to be here when we dive into the next mystery, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a Dreamtime Documents upload. We have more of these to do, much more. There are more questions than answers in this ancient world, and every one of them deserves this kind of attention. Leave a comment below. Tell me which parallel surprised you most. Tell me what you think the connection is. Tell me what keeps you thinking about this at 3 in the morning when you should be asleep, because that's what this is all for. Good night.